At this time, let's begin today's TC 101 webinar hosted by Our Transportation Future. It is my pleasure to introduce your moderator today, Bruce Ho, Senior Advocate, Climate and Clean Energy Program, NRDC. With that, Bruce, I'll hand the floor over to you.
Good afternoon, and welcome to this webinar on the Transportation and Climate Initiative 101, hosted by the Our Transportation Future Coalition. My name is Bruce Ho, and I'm a Senior Advocate in the Climate and Clean Energy Program at the Natural Resources Defense Council, or NRDC. And I want to thank everyone who's participating today live on the webinar, as well as anyone who's listening to the webinar recording after the fact. Participants today include advocates, interested businesses, policymakers, residents of Northeast and Mid-Atlantic states, and members of the media. And we appreciate all of you taking the time to learn more about both the Our Transportation Future Coalition and the Transportation and Climate Initiative, also known as TCI. We have a full agenda today, and I'm joined by several distinguished speakers. We're scheduled to go for an hour, and that will include about 35 minutes of presentations, followed by about 25 minutes for question and answers. I'm going to kick things off with some brief overview remarks, and then it will be my pleasure to turn things over to our other presenters, including several of my colleagues in the Our Transportation Future Coalition. You'll hear today from Jennifer Wallace-Broder, Director of Transportation Efficiency at the Vermont Energy Investment Corporation, or VEIC, Lee Matsueda, Political Director at Alternatives for Community and Environment, also representing the Green Justice Coalition, Lindsay Mendelson, Transportation Representative for the Sierra Club in Maryland, Jordan Stutt, Carbon Programs Director at the Acadia Center, Allie Gold-Roberts, Senior Manager of State Policy at Ceres, and last but not least, Angela Johnson-Rodriguez, who is the Transportation Justice Organizer at Transportation for Massachusetts. We'll conclude the webinar with listener Q&A, and as our webinar host Jessica mentioned at the beginning, if you'd like to ask a question during the presentation, you can do so by submitting it via the Q&A panel on the right-hand side of your screen. We'll come back to your questions at the end, and although we may not be able to answer all of the questions in the allotted time, we will do our best to cover questions from as many listeners as we can. We'll also post an audio recording of this webinar online at www.ourtransportationfuture.org/webinar later this afternoon. Let's take a step back for a minute for a quick overview. Why are we here? As you may know, TCI, the Transportation and Climate Initiative, includes 12 states: Connecticut, Delaware, Maine, Maryland, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, New Jersey, New York, Pennsylvania, Rhode Island, Vermont, and Virginia, as well as the city of Washington, D.C. And these jurisdictions are working together to develop a regional low-carbon transportation policy. As I hope you'll take away from today's discussion, these states in D.C. and residents and businesses in the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic have a tremendous opportunity through this policy to develop a modern, 21st century transportation system for the region that is cleaner, more accessible, and works better for everyone, whether you live in an urban, suburban, or rural community. Such a system would include safe, walkable, and bikeable communities, smart land use planning and affordable housing near transit, efficient public transportation like buses and trains accessible by all communities, and clean electric vehicles, including electric trucks and transit buses that reduce pollution in our neighborhoods and on our roads. The TCI states are engaged in a public process with the region's stakeholders to develop a policy framework that will help get us there. Our Transportation Future is a coalition of stakeholders engaging in these discussions to ensure that they result in a robust and equitable regional policy that will chart a brighter future for all in the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic region. I'll now turn the presentation over to my colleague, Jennifer Wallace-Broder, who's the Director of Transportation Efficiency at the Vermont Energy Investment Corporation, to provide additional details and background on the Our Transportation Future Coalition, who we are, and what our goals are. Jennifer?
Thanks so much, Bruce. My name is Jennifer Wallace-Broder. I'm the Transportation Efficiency Director at VEIC. And VEIC is a sustainable energy company with a mission to enhance the economic, environmental, and societal benefits of clean and efficient energy use for all people. We have offices in Vermont, Washington, D.C., and New York. I am pleased to be here to share information on Our Transportation Future, which is a coalition of local, regional, and national organizations committed to modernizing transportation across the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic region. If you haven't heard of the coalition, that's okay because it's pretty new. It was formed this spring and includes leading business, health, environmental, and science interests. There are currently 55 organizations who are part of the coalition, representing every state in the region. Our transportation future is working together with business and governmental leaders to develop a 21st century regional transportation system that is cleaner, offers more varied, accessible, and affordable transportation options, and serves the needs of everyone. Shortly, you will be hearing more about this initiative from my colleagues. Members of the coalition see this initiative as an important component of this vision and are advocating for states in the region to develop a policy that is robust and equitable. Overall, we know our transportation system needs to be modernized. Too many people lack affordable, reliable transportation that connects them to jobs, services, the community, family, and friends. And everyone can benefit from cleaner vehicles that reduce our exposure to harmful pollution. Our transportation future is bringing together organizations across the region to tackle this challenge. If you haven't already, we welcome you to join us. And that concludes my presentation.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. To provide additional context on the challenges that we're trying to solve for people who live in the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic region through TCI and related efforts, it's my pleasure to introduce now Lee Matsueda, Political Director at Alternatives for Community and Environment, who is also here representing the Green Justice Coalition. Lee, please go ahead.
Hey, thanks, Bruce, and hello, everyone. I'm gonna jump right in. I want to ask you, how do you confront problems? Are you the type that takes initiative, has the space in your life to be proactive, the skill or the personality to be direct? I think many of us want to be that person, and yet we and our society often wait for as long as we possibly can until we have to deal with the problem, maybe to the point where it's gotten way too big. From personal experience, take for example my twin boys. They're 2.5. They've been climbing out of their cribs for the past month and a half. I think it's cute how they kind of lob themselves over the railing saying, uh-oh. But I thought to myself yesterday after I recorded the whole thing, added some music, sent it out to my family, I got to make time to deal with this before one of them gets hurt. And when problems get bigger, stakes get higher, there's no time to waste, and we have to be direct and honest in order to make progress, and in this case on our climate and transportation issues, our climate and transportation crisis. We also have to remember why we care, because there are real and severe consequences if we wait too long. So in the few minutes I have remaining, I'm going to offer 3 things for you all to consider. First, our people. Second, our planet. And third, our process. And as sobering as these next 2 slides may be, I really hope they move us to creating a more meaningful community and stakeholder engagement. We got to move to take urgent action and to embrace a suite of solutions that really transform our communities and our planet for the better. So for me, my work in climate and transportation justice really starts with my family and the communities I have the privilege of working with. And in thinking about them, their safety, and the communities I care about, I got to be honest, people are suffering, even dying, because of our tendency to push things off until it's too late. While people are experiencing increased rates of asthma, asthma-related ER visits, asthma-related mortality, we're talking death. I think 10 of the top 25 worst cities in the country for asthma are here in the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic. And in fact, this is how my organization, ACE, got into transit organizing and advocacy, because every kid in the classroom we visited either had or knew someone with asthma. In addition, many families, particularly low-income households in even more rural communities, are stranded, left with little access to health care and social services because of their transportation network. And this is particularly troubling at a time where more and more people are being displaced from urban centers. We spend more time commuting. People know this because of congestion, because of crumbling roads, bridges, highways, and because public transit systems are failing to meet the needs of the public. Some are even breaking down. We know 5 of the top 10 most congested cities are in this region, including Boston, pictured here, D.C., New York, Philly, Pittsburgh. We're also billions of dollars short of funding needed to achieve a state of good repair for roads and bridges and transit infrastructure. We have a responsibility to get this right, get off fossil fuels, clean up our communities, especially those that bear an unfair burden, and invest in a sustainable transportation system that meets the needs of our communities and our people. directly linked to our communities and our families is this planet we live on, right? The environment we interact with every day. We keep extracting, consuming, and polluting. Our transportation system, how we move people and goods, is dated, is inefficient, costly, unhealthy, and our gasoline and diesel-burning fuels are not only a source of major air pollution, but also the largest source of climate pollution. In 2016, 42% of carbon dioxide emissions come from that sector. In addition, the number of 90 and 100-degree days that are projected for our concrete and asphalt-covered cities and towns is staggering. You see the image here of D.C. and the heat islands. Families are without homes. Communities are paying millions and millions of dollars to rebuild after extreme weather events and superstorms like Sandy or 100-year flooding events that are now happening every 10 years. And the projections in terms of sea level rise threaten to put coastal communities underwater. The time is running out, and though our planet may be able to heal itself, that works only until a certain point, and many would argue that we're close to going beyond that point. Process. So if our communities truly deserve to be healthy, to survive, to thrive, we not only have to get off fossil fuels, improve transportation access and options, deal with the legacy of pollution in these communities, but we have to get the process right. We can't leave those most severely affected by climate and transportation crisis behind. And the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, RGGI, didn't exactly get that right, but we have another opportunity if we figure out a way to put the interests of these communities front and center. And that will show up not just in terms of where revenues from a program like Transportation and Climate Initiative are prioritized, but how we get there. So in closing, I know it's a lot of doom and gloom, but the success of initiatives like this, I believe, hinge on the ability to be honest and direct, to engage, listen, and take leadership from communities directly affected by climate and transportation crisis, including the labor force. And many of these communities already have the solutions. Some are already putting them into effect. We also have to remember who we care about, why we do what we do, and hopefully it's something that uplifts the communities and the people we care about and our planet. I ask that we don't wait. I'm not going to wait to fix my kids' beds. I'm going to take off the sides. But seriously, though, people's lives are at stake. I want to thank you for the opportunity, and I look forward to the rest of the presentation and your questions.
Thank you, Lee. Now to provide additional details about TCI and Northeast and Mid-Atlantic states' commitment to develop a low-carbon transportation policy and their process and engagement with stakeholders to date, we'll hear from Lindsay Mendelson, the transportation representative for the Sierra Club in Maryland. Lindsay?
Thank you, Bruce. In 2010, Mid-Atlantic, Northeast states, and D.C. issued a statement of intent to work together to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from the transportation sector by forming a collaboration called the Transportation and Climate Initiative. These states intended a collaboration to reduce the reliance on high carbon fuels, reduce vehicle miles traveled on our roadways, and support sustainable growth. And in order to meet these goals, states have been seeking to accelerate zero-emission vehicles, including cars, buses, trucks, expand walking, biking, and transit use, and support new technologies. And Georgetown Climate Center has been helping to facilitate these conversations with the states. Next slide. Several of these states came together a couple years ago to explore a regional policy that would achieve these goals with a specific focus on market-based approaches to transforming our transportation sector. Between March and August of last year, TCI hosted 6 sessions to gain stakeholder input on what this policy would look like and what the outcomes would be. And over 500 people across the region attended these sessions, and Georgetown Climate Center, who helped facilitate these sessions, released a summary of the responses from what they heard. And the most common response from participants was creating a policy that would put a price on carbon emissions from the transportation sector and reinvest those proceeds. Next slide. After these sessions in December, 9 states and D.C. announced that they would be designing a program to cap and reduce carbon emissions from the combustion of transportation fuels and invest the proceeds from the program into low and zero carbon forms of transportation, which is really exciting. Happened again in December of last year. And the participating states in this collaboration so far from TCI have included Connecticut, Delaware, Maryland, Massachusetts, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Rhode Island, Vermont, Virginia, and D.C. Since that statement was announced in December, TCI has held a workshop in Boston on the design elements of a program, a workshop focusing on equity and what a program would look like in New Jersey, and a webinar on data inputs and assumptions of such a policy in May. Next slide. Now, while the details of the program are still being hashed out with input from communities, there's some information that can give us a ballpark of the magnitude of what a policy could actually look like. So in 2015, Georgetown Climate Center and Cambridge Systematics released a report to show clean transportation area of reducing emissions 38% under 2005 levels would yield $3 billion annually in investments across the region. And they actually calculated that this would create 100,000 new jobs and save families $13.4 billion. So that just gives you a ballpark of what such a policy could look like and some of its impacts. Now, the graph on the right describes how much pollution is being emitted in the transportation sector in the states, the equivalent of 61 million passenger cars driving for a year, which is pretty significant. So the report found that cutting pollution this much would have a significant amount of public health benefits and save thousands of lives. It's also notable that this is not the first major undertaking that the states have participated in. 10 Northeast and Mid-Atlantic states have participated in a program to cut emissions from the power sector and invest in clean energy, energy efficiency, and consumer benefit programs. And they've been doing this since 2010 through a policy called the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. And that concludes my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you for that background, Lindsay. Next, we're joined by Jordan Stutt, Carbon Programs Director at the Acadia Center, who will discuss the policy approach known as Cap and Invest that Northeast and Mid-Atlantic states are currently exploring under TCI and how it would address the region's transportation challenges. Jordan?
Thanks, Bruce. I am Jordan Stutt, Carbon Programs Director at Acadia Center. Acadia Center is an environmental research and advocacy organization active throughout the Northeast, and we're committed to advancing the clean energy future. But we can't achieve that vision unless we take serious action to address both the pollution and inequities stemming from our current transportation system. That's why we're supporting a suite of transportation policies, including a cap and trade program, a cap and invest program through TCI. So what is cap and invest? Well, simply, it's a policy tool to limit pollution from a set of designated sources, and it results in proceeds that can be invested to achieve public goals. And the TCI states have a lot of familiarity with this general model, dating back to the Federal Acid Rain Program from 1995, a cap-and-trade program to reduce sulfur dioxide pollution from power plants. More recently, 10 of the TCI states launched the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, as Lindsay mentioned. And more recently than that, California and Quebec have been participating together in the Western Climate Initiative, a cap and invest program that covers CO2 emissions from multiple sectors, including the transportation sector. So the TCI states have plenty of experience to learn from, and perhaps most importantly, a history of bipartisan collaboration and multi-state cooperation to develop this type of program. And while the TCI states are working hard to develop this cap and invest program, it's important that we as stakeholders recognize that this policy doesn't operate in a vacuum. It works best when paired with complementary policies, many of which are already in place, a number of which still need to be developed on an urgent timeline. Now, getting into the fundamentals of how a cap and invest program will function, it all starts with the cap, the limit on emissions from covered sources. In the TCI context, that means transportation emissions, and we're essentially looking at the CO2 emissions that come from tailpipes of cars, buses, and trucks. And once the states assess those CO2 emissions, they can start to create a baseline or starting point for that cap. That cap then has to be elongated out through a determined timeline, and that timeline and rate of decline will determine how aggressive the states want to be environmentally. So for example, that cap might begin at the current emissions baseline and decline to 2030, requiring emissions reductions somewhere like 50% from a 1990 baseline. And once the states have answered that question of environmental ambition and the sources that will be covered, they have a single regional cap in place for CO2 emissions from the transportation sector. And tied to the cap level that is set are emissions allowances, which are created by the states. One allowance is equal to 1 ton of CO2. So, for example, if the cap in a given year is 300 million tons of CO2, there would be 300 million allowances created. Compliance entities in this program would be required to submit 1 allowance for each ton of CO2 that they're responsible for. And individual drivers wouldn't have to worry about allowances. This would be a responsibility that would be assessed further upstream in the fuel supply chain to fuel suppliers. And those fuel suppliers responsible for the CO2 content of their fuels would have to buy those allowances through auctions. And the sale of those allowances through auctions would generate proceeds for the states to invest. And that brings us to the exciting part of the Cap and Invest program, which is investing those TCI proceeds. And there's a good likelihood that the states would agree to some general principles at the regional level about how those proceeds should be invested. And we have a sense of what the states are thinking from their December 2018 TCI announcement, which noted the importance of reducing climate change and pollution, creating economic opportunity, and improving transportation equity for overburdened and underserved communities. But the specific investments needed to achieve those goals will vary quite a bit from state to state. In some states like Vermont or Maine, there's likely to be more of a focus on providing solutions to rural transportation challenges. In other locations, there might be a greater focus on modernizing and expanding public transit. But whether it's electric buses, bike lanes, or EV charging stations, these are investments that will deliver better transportation options and cleaner air. And one last thing that I'll note, this was a very high-level presentation on the Cap and Invest mechanics. For more information, I would suggest going to the Transportation and Climate Initiative website. They have a great Cap and Invest 101 webinar that dives deeper into a lot of these questions. And that concludes my remarks.
Thank you, Jordan, for walking us through the proposed policy approach. And while the TCI states are exploring Cap and Invest, there are still many questions that must be answered as they work to develop the final policy. And Allie Gold-Roberts, Senior Manager of State Policy at Ceres, is here to discuss some of those key questions to be addressed in the weeks and months ahead. Allie, please go ahead.
Thanks so much, Bruce, and I think this is the best section because we don't necessarily know the answers to all of these questions yet, but hopefully through public input and the folks who join us in this webinar, we can really find the answers. So as Bruce said, I'm Allie Gold-Roberts. I lead the state policy program at Ceres. We are a national nonprofit organization working with companies and investors to build a more sustainable global economy. Here in the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic, we have the pleasure of working with companies and investors to decarbonize the electric and transportation sectors. And as I mentioned, here are some of the outstanding questions, particularly initially here on the program design. We don't know how the emissions cap will work, as Jordan outlined, what could potentially be the final proposal, but it's really up to the states to decide what that looks like. And Georgetown Climate Center did a great report that outlined most likely this would involve compliance entities would be the prime suppliers, or essentially the large fuel wholesalers or importers. On the question around fuels, most likely gasoline and diesel are the most likely fuels to be targeted, but jet fuel and other fuels are up for discussion for sure. When we think about the states, the presenters before me outlined all of the states that have been part of the TCI process, but currently New York is not in this initial policy discussion but has been part of the broader process, so will they join? Maine and New Hampshire have been tracking the discussions. Will they ultimately join? How large will the final program look? Around the ambition of the program and the cap, those are certainly a lot of questions about, what will be the needs at the outset. Either the cap needs to be low or the price floor high, or quickly adjusting to meet emissions reductions. So there are a lot of questions about how ambitious and how quickly all of these things will go into place. And of course, around EJ communities, with certain industrial emissions, there'll be potentially an opportunity to localize the emissions reductions, but with other things like transit or fleets, we may not be able to do that. So lots of things for states to consider. Around the investments, and I think this is probably the area where people are most interested in what will happen to the revenue, but questions around, will the states do this individually, or will some of it be decided regionally? Of course, how can revenue be used to address equity concerns? This has been, a model of this has been done in California around some of their work. And of course, how can we drive down emissions, whether that's through electric vehicles, alternative vehicles, charging infrastructure, public transit, smart growth, land use. The policy options are ambitious. And then, of course, you know, how will the states approve this policy? Will it be through governors? Will it be through legislators? Will it be both? And we're already starting to see some states pass legislation indicating their interest in moving in this direction. And then finally, as I mentioned, complementary policies are a huge question when it comes to states already having some existing programs that start to move in this direction, or work towards building out transportation infrastructure, whether that's gas taxes, an opportunity for congestion pricing in certain areas. Certain states have it, certain cities do, others don't. Looking at the interactions between the electric power sector and how, as we plug in more things, how can we continue to reduce emissions in the electric power sector? What are the electric vehicle charging networks? How can we continue to leverage federal dollars? So there are a lot of questions at play, and opportunities for states to identify how these policies will work in concert and can be leveraged across the region. And then finally, this kind of tees up the next speaker, but there are a lot of opportunities for public input. As I mentioned, there are a lot of questions that need to be answered, and folks have an opportunity to share their voice. Ceres has the great pleasure of working with the business community to share their perspective, but there are a lot of ways for folks to share their voice, to share their preferences, to connect with state lawmakers and governors so that this is a policy that really works for all. So with that, I'll kick it over to the next speaker. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Allie. So what happens next? To answer that, I'm pleased to introduce Angela Johnson-Rodriguez, who is the Transportation Justice Organizer at Transportation for Massachusetts. And Jess, could you please advance slide? Thank you. Angela?
All right, thank you, Bruce. Hi, everyone. My name is Angela Johnson-Rodriguez, and I'll be laying out the timeline for TCI going forward. So for phase one, from January to March, that has included much of the behind-the-scenes work and planning by the TCI states in preparation for this year's stakeholder workshops in Boston, Newark, and upcoming in Baltimore. During these sessions, this is where the states were soliciting public input on policy choices and design. Right now, we're currently in phase 2 of 2019, and phase 2 typically is running from April to July, which includes these public workshops where modeling and policy analysis really come into play. From now until the end of July, many of the states will also continue to conduct outreach with their state stakeholders in parallel to the regional TCI process, and then share those insights at the regional level. On the advocate side, members of the Our Transportation Future Coalition and other groups are also talking about TCI, what it means for their communities, and coordinating on how to ensure that the final policy is both robust and equitable. Then moving into phase 3, which runs from August to November of this year, the states will review their technical analysis and modeling results along with the stakeholder input to draft policy options that are suited for the needs of communities and up. As the states put together their policy options, it will be particularly important to ensure that these options and their expected outcomes are communicated to stakeholders in ways that are both relatable and understandable, so that people can see how a TCI policy would benefit them and their communities. Finally, in phase 4, which will be December of this year, that's the end of this current round. By December, the TCI states will have come to a decision on what a low-carbon transportation policy will look like for the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic states, based on all the technical and policy work they've done and the stakeholder input they've received throughout the year. So moving forward into TCI in 2020 and beyond, because really we've been focusing on 2019 because it's the most critical year. However, the TCI process is likely to continue beyond December of this year. Depending on the form of the TCI policy proposal, individual states may need to adopt new legislation or develop new state rules to implement the agreement and achieve its benefits. For states that choose to move forward, this process is likely to begin in 2020. In their 2018 agreement, TCI states committed to begin implementing a regional policy once a critical mass of states formally adopts it into their state laws. The exact timing for implementation and the threshold for moving forward is likely to be a part of the state's discussions and negotiations through the end of this year. Based on the timeline as sketched out, if the states do move forward with a cap and invest approach, implementation of the pollution cap would potentially begin as early as 2021. Once the cap is up and running, we would start to see proceeds from the allowance auctions Jordan mentioned, which would be invested in clean and modern transportation solutions, like better, more accessible public transportation, more livable and walkable and bikeable communities, and clean, non-polluting electric buses, trucks, and other vehicles according to the needs of the individual states. So this all sounds pretty exciting. And I'll go ahead and turn it over to Bruce, who will let you all know how to get involved to make sure that TCI will be as robust and equitable as humanly possible. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Angela, and to all of our earlier presenters. Again, I'm Bruce Ho with NRDC. If we could advance to the next slide, please. So as you've heard, we have a tremendous opportunity to reimagine our current transportation system and address many of the challenges that we face through TCI. But there's still much to do, and to succeed, it's important that Northeast and Mid-Atlantic stakeholders be involved and help shape these discussions by making our voices heard. So how can listeners get involved and ensure that the TCI process addresses your and your community's transportation needs? Well, first, to learn more about the Tci discussions, we invite you to visit the Our Transportation Future Coalition website at www.ourtransportationfuture.org. On the website, you can also sign up to receive our coalition's monthly newsletter, which covers headlines and public announcements on TCI and related efforts to modernize and share the benefits of cleaner transportation. You can also stay up to date by following Our Transportation Future on Twitter, where our handle is @TransportationFuture. That's TRANSPO Future. Second, if you represent an organization that would like to join the Our Transportation Future Coalition to help achieve a robust and equitable regional clean transportation policy, please let us know by emailing us at join@ourtransportationfuture.org. Members of the media are also welcome to contact us at news@ourtransportationfuture.org with interview requests and other inquiries. With that, I and the other presenters you've heard from this afternoon look forward to addressing the questions that have already been coming in throughout the presentation. And as a reminder, if you would like to ask a question and haven't yet done so, please submit it to us using the Q&A panel on the right-hand side of your screen, and we will try to get through as many of these questions as possible. So we had a couple of just clarifying questions that I'll address first and then turn some over to my fellow panelists. So one question was, who is it exactly that's made this TCI commitment that you've heard about, the commitment made in December 2018? And similarly, we had a question, clarifying question, a reminder, again, who is TCI? So let me go back to this earlier slide. This is the Tci region. It's 12 states plus DC. It includes a number of states in the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic region. And so those are the states that are currently involved in these discussions, although it's possible that at some point they may expand. There may be other states that could also come into this process. But these are the current ones. Now, as far as who is it that's actually involved in TCI and who is it that's made the commitment? TCI as an organization is composed of state environmental, energy, and transportation agencies, and ultimately reporting up to the governor of the individual states, or in the case of DC, the mayor. So at this point, the discussions about a regional low-carbon transportation policy have been taking place at the governor and state agency level. And that's where these discussions are going to continue for the rest of this year as the states work together to develop a proposed policy. As Angela mentioned, once there's a proposed policy out there, individual states will have to adopt it legally into their own laws. And at that point, we will also likely see legislation advance. So you'll see state legislators involved in these discussions as well. But at this point, what we're talking about are these discussions going on between governors and between state environmental, transportation, and energy agencies. So hopefully that helps give folks an understanding about some of the mechanics of TCI. Another question we've received, and Jordan, I'm going to pass this one off to you, but we're talking about one policy here, cap and invest, that the states are pursuing under TCI. But what's the role of other policies in the transportation sphere, including policies related to vehicle fuel efficiency or investments in electric vehicles and transportation? Jordan, could you provide some more details on this?
Sure. Thanks, Bruce. And that's a great question here. I would actually start by looking at the lessons we've learned in the electric sector through the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. Complementary policies there, like energy efficiency and renewable energy programs, which have received funding from Tci Proceeds, have helped the region achieve emissions reductions much faster and at a much lower cost. So we need to see similar complementary policies like that in the transportation sector to pair with TCI. So in the case of fuel efficiency standards and EV incentives, those will help accelerate the market and accessibility of cleaner transportation options. Other policies like greater investment in public transit and making our streets and communities more bikeable and more walkable will give people better options if they want to drive less. And all of those policies will help us achieve faster emissions reductions, and they'll help us do it at a lower cost. So I think we need to think about how Tci Proceeds can help drive those complementary policies forward. We also need to think about another bucket of complementary policies, which are more focused on where we're achieving those emissions reductions. Thinking about the communities that have been historically overburdened by transportation pollution, and making sure that we're putting policies in place that ensure emissions reductions in those communities to really help address the disproportionate health burden those communities have faced from air pollution. And turn it back to you, Bruce, or others if you want to chime in.
Thank you, Jordan. Any other thoughts? Okay, so we've been receiving a number of other questions. Thank you again, everyone, for submitting them so far. One question that we've been seeing is, so we're talking here as, largely groups that are in this Our Transportation Future Coalition, but some people are asking, well, who else is involved, or kind of who else is supporting, or what's the level of support and engagement? Lindsay, I wonder if you could provide some details on some polling that the Sierra Club has done.
Yes, of course. So last June, Sierra Club released a poll surveying thousands of voters across the region, and they found a high level of support for a policy to modernize transportation and invest in electric vehicles and public transportation. Specifically, they found that 7 in 10 voters across the Mid-Atlantic and Northeast region supported a policy to do that, to reduce emissions, support increasing fuel efficiency, and creating safer communities for walking and biking. And it was also notable that there was a high level of bipartisan support as well. So in terms of a breakdown of Democrats, Independents, and Republicans, folks on all sides of the aisle were generally supportive of this idea.
Great, thank you, Lindsay. And Allie, could you chime in with a few details of the work that Ceres has been doing in working with some companies and others?
Sure, absolutely. Thanks, Bruce. So last summer, about 50 companies and investors alongside 20 colleges and universities shared their support to all of the governors who were considering TCI to let them know that the business community is really behind this effort. We are looking for a market-based solution to addressing transportation emissions and an opportunity to use that revenue to drive down emissions across the region. This group of businesses will continue to be engaged once the policy proposal comes out, but has also participated in some of the listening sessions that have happened to date. And we're seeing other business groups across the states weigh in, whether that's local chambers or state-based groups or some of the national businesses that we work with, really having a thoughtful discussion about how do we attract high-quality businesses and employees and create a beautiful quality of life that really addresses the needs and challenges that we face around transportation, and TCI is one of the many tools in the toolbox to get us there. So the business community has really been at the table throughout these conversations, and I think will continue to be in the dialogue, given that it's really essential to the competitiveness of the region. So if any businesses are listening in on the phone today, I invite you to be part of the process with us or through other state-based or regional-based business organizations that you work with, because we've heard loud and clear from the governors and from the staff level that there's really an interest in figuring out how this works for the business community.
Thank you, Allie. We've also received some questions about how the TCI policy would affect drivers in particular communities. I think one of the areas that people are interested in is learning how would this policy affect people in rural drivers or in rural areas or perhaps suburban areas. Jennifer, I'm wondering if you could address this question.
Yeah, absolutely. I work for an organization that's based in Vermont, and so we are acutely aware of the challenges with our current transportation system for rural drivers. So people often have to travel long distances to get to work or services. They often have unreliable transportation that could put jobs at jeopardy. So there's a lot of challenges, and sometimes the solutions that maybe work in more urban areas just can't be supported by low density in rural areas. So this is a really good question, because there is work to be done. But with that said, I think for those folks who are auto-dependent and can their maintenance costs can actually really be a benefit to the household budget. So that's one thing that I think really needs to be thought through. Another that I think is really important to keep in mind is that there are many people throughout the region that don't have access to a vehicle. They can't drive. Maybe they can't afford to pay a ticket, and so they've lost their license. So, and this is particularly acute for people that live in rural areas. So I think there's a real opportunity to engage rural communities to identify solutions that are going to meet the mobility needs of the elderly, to low-income folks that can't afford a vehicle, and others that are really challenged by mobility overall, and see what kind of investments will make improvements in their daily lives and allow them to access the things they want and need to in the community. So I think there's a few ways to be thinking about that. And going back to Lee's comments at the beginning of the presentation, much like many of the communities that stand to benefit from this policy, it's really important to have a robust engagement strategy for working with folks in rural areas to identify the solutions that are going to work for them and build those into the policy, the reinvestment policies in each state.
Thank you, Jennifer. We've also received a number of questions having to do with the need to make public transit more accessible and equitable, and questions about how we might be able to both achieve some of the emissions and efficiency benefits, but also ensure that TCI is really helping overburdened and disadvantaged people in our urban areas and our low-income communities. Lee, could you take that question, please?
Yeah, for sure, Bruce. I mean, it's a great question, because I think equity is a loaded term, right? Depending on who you talk to, it's about geography, it's about income, it's about race. And so, when I think about it, I also, want to emphasize, and this is what I've been doing throughout the whole TCI process, is saying, it is about process too. It's about who we engage, how we engage them, and that has to go well beyond sort of the comfort zone of some of the states and the process that they're comfortable with. And so I think that is really important, these types of one-on-one sessions and figuring out how we talk to folks who are affected across the entire region, not just in cities, but across entire regions, because public transportation is one solution that I care about deeply because of the communities I work with, but that might not work for some of the rural communities that others have been speaking to, and it doesn't. The other thing I would just mention is, there are opportunities that TCI could take now to surface, and I think Jordan kind of spoke to this earlier, like it's really important to think about what are the complementary, I guess is the phrase that's been used, policies that we can support and move in the short term. As TCI rolls forward, there's a lot that can be done to address some of the climate impacts, transportation issues, and TCI doesn't have to be that, it can't solve all those issues. And so I think in the short term, there's opportunities to address that, and I hope this TCI process creates momentum towards it. The last thing I would just say is, the investment side, right? There's a session coming up in Baltimore, Maryland, I think at the end of July that Angela mentioned. States, have to work with communities and stakeholders to make sure investment is prioritized and thought about very, carefully in terms of this question about equity. And so, for groups like ours, we're going to talk about, the needs of low-income communities and people from communities of color. And so those are just a few of my thoughts.
Thank you, Lee. We've had a number of questions come in about costs. So people are interested in, what will this cost, how will it affect consumers, and who is ultimately going to pay for the costs of the clean energy solutions that we've been talking about today. Jordan, would you mind addressing that question?
Sure. So as I mentioned earlier, it's likely that fuel suppliers, those selling or bringing fuel into this region that'll be combusted in our vehicles, would have to purchase allowances based on the amount of carbon content of their fuels. And so there will be a cost that they incur for that. We don't know exactly what that would be yet. That'll be a product of the cap level. It'll also be a product of how quickly we can achieve our emissions reductions. If we can go faster than expected, those costs will be lower than projected. But there is a chance that those fuel suppliers could pass along some share of that cost. But it's important to compare that to the benefits of the program. Even if we look past the climate benefits, even if we look past the substantial public health benefits from avoided co-pollutant emissions, and if we just look at the benefits to drivers from things like reduced traffic, better public transit, better access to electric vehicles, which mean that drivers can use a lower cost fuel to get around, I think we'll see that the benefits would dwarf the costs here.
Thank you, Jordan. We also got a question about the timing of the TCI effort and what do we think is likely or realistic for the states involved here. So Angela laid out a slide that showed the process that the states have communicated for 2019, and then a second slide that showed what we think might happen next, where states may decide to start adopting the policy into law in 2020, and then, as Angela said, the soonest we might see a policy like cap and invest come into play or actually start being implemented is 2021. So is that realistic, or is this likely to take longer? The answer is we don't know the exact timeline yet. What we do know is that the states have committed by the end of 2019 to develop a proposed policy. The good news on that, although there are a number of questions that need to be answered, as you've heard on this webinar today, is the states are working off of a familiar policy model. It's an approach that they've taken in the power sector for addressing CO2 emissions. It's also an approach that's been taken in the power sector for addressing other air pollutants like sulfur dioxide, which causes acid rain. It's also an approach that has been implemented, as Jordan said earlier, in a number of other regions, including to address transportation emissions. So California and Quebec both have an existing cap and invest policy that also includes transportation. So it is possible that the states could implement a policy as early as 2021. We will have to see what happens after the draft policy is issued at the end of this year, and then what the adoption process looks like in 2020. So to be determined, but I would encourage anyone who's interested in this to get involved in the stakeholder process, provide your feedback on what the timeline should be or could be, and let the states know, because they are actively seeking input from stakeholders. We also received a question or two about cap and invest as this approach versus the possibility of another mechanism like a carbon tax. Jordan or Allie, I'm wondering if one of you might be able to jump in and discuss why it is the states are pursuing this policy and how it maybe relates to carbon tax or efforts that some states are also looking at related to carbon taxes.
Sure. This is Jordan. I can jump in on that, but Allie, please add to whatever it is I say. I think the cap and invest model is very familiar to the TCI states. They've seen how successful it can be. They've benefited from the regional partnership through cap and invest before. So I think it's understandably attractive to them. I think it's also something that could be paired with a state level or even a regional carbon tax. I know that in a number of the states that we're working in, we're supporting carbon pricing legislation. In Massachusetts, there's a carbon pricing bill that is designed to be complementary to a TCI cap and invest program, recognizing that we still have a large chunk of our emissions that wouldn't be covered by TCI, wouldn't be covered by the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, and we don't have time to let 40% of our CO2 emissions go unaddressed. So I think there's clear urgency to act here. I think we need all of the carbon pricing policies that we can, but we really need to make sure that they are well aligned and complementary. Allie or Bruce, anything else?
Yeah. I would agree with you, Jordan. I also think that it's exciting that all of these states are interested in collaborating on transportation and getting this sector under control. As you mentioned, it's now, the top emitting sector that we need to really look at, but it certainly does not preclude our ability to look at carbon taxes either at the state level or across the region, and many of the organizations that are participating in this coalition are working on multiple mechanisms to reduce emissions from multiple sectors. So it's certainly exciting to move forward with this transportation climate initiative and get advocates and states working collaboratively, and I think the history of the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative demonstrates the economies of scale working across the region, but we also hope to see a price on carbon in other sectors as well, and a lot of exciting movement across the states and nationally in this area.
Great. Thank you so much both for those responses. So we are just about at the top of the hour, and I think that's probably all the time we have to address questions right now. I know that we did receive a number of other questions, so apologies to people that did ask other questions that we weren't able to get to. I would like to thank all of our panelists for participating today, as well as all of our viewers for tuning in and asking the many excellent and insightful questions. I also encourage you, I'll go back to earlier slide, I encourage you to visit the Our Transportation Future Coalition website at www.ourtransportationfuture.org. On that website, we also have additional background information on TCI and our coalition. And if you click on the News and Resources section at the top of the screen, we also have a frequently asked questions, or FAQ document, that you may find useful in answering some of the questions that we weren't able to get to today. As mentioned earlier, we will post today's webinar on the Our Transportation Future website as well, so feel free to review it later if there's any topics that you want to learn more about or listen to again. And please do forward that recording to friends and colleagues who may be interested in learning more about TCI or our coalition as well. Finally, please do feel free to reach out to us, which you can do via the website. Follow us on Twitter at TranspoFuture. And let us know if your organization is interested in joining Our Transportation Future. We hope that you will get involved in the TCI discussions this year and that together we can build a modern 21st century transportation system that's cleaner, more accessible, and works better for everyone. So with that, thank you again, and we hope that you have a wonderful rest of your day.